This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report, as we continue our climate countdown. We are here for 2 weeks, Glasgow and New York, bringing you comprehensive coverage inside the COP, outside on the streets, and around the world for people who couldn't make it to the UN Climate Summit, but are active in their own communities. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. As we continue our coverage of negotiations at COP26 and the push to address the growing climate crisis by reducing greenhouse gas emissions and funding the transition to renewable energy. Critics note the Paris Agreement, the legally binding international treaty from the 2015 UN Climate Summit, does not mention the words coal, oil, or gas once. Momentum's now building for a complementary international mechanism to manage a global just transition. This is a video produced by the campaign to establish a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty.
The generation that grew up with nuclear weapons were told to hide under their desks in case of attack. This generation faces an even greater threat, the climate crisis. And again, they have nowhere to hide. While citizens, cities and countries are working to reduce their emissions, behind our backs, the coal, oil and gas industry continues to rapidly expand fossil fuels, driving catastrophic warming. Surviving the climate crisis requires a bold new idea. Introducing the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. Why a treaty? 50 years ago, the world signed a non-proliferation treaty to avoid nuclear war. In 1987, the Montreal Protocol protected the ozone. The Paris Agreement begins to limit emissions, but doesn't mention coal, oil, or gas. We need a global plan to end the proliferation of fossil fuels and fast-track solutions. A fossil fuel treaty would phase out coal, oil, and gas faster, more fairly, and forever, while supporting workers, communities and countries dependent on fossil fuels.
This comes as securing money for poor nations to help cut emissions and adapt to the effects of climate change, so-called loss and damage, is a key focus at COP26. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson and the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi co-chaired an event this week to launch a fund to help small island developing states build infrastructure to cope with rising sea levels. This is Modi speaking in Glasgow.
Excellencies, the Infrastructure for Resilient Island States launch gives a new hope, a new trust, a new chance for vulnerable countries to do something.
India is the world's third biggest emitter of greenhouse gases after China and the United States. For more, we're joined from inside COP26 in Glasgow, Scotland, by Harjeet Singh, Senior Advisor with Climate Action Network and with the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, based in New Delhi, India usually, but in Glasgow now. Welcome back, Harjeet, to Democracy Now! The fossil fuel, if you can talk more about the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, what has to be done to prevent the climate emergency from devastating the world even further?
Maybe this is a huge challenge here that we are talking about cutting emissions and mitigation, but we are not putting enough focus on fossil fuel. We are not even mentioning fossil fuel in our discussions. How can you not talk about the elephant in the room, one that has caused the crisis? And the whole negotiations are just avoiding the term coal, oil and gas. It's there on the outside, but not in Paris Agreement. And unless you target fossil fuel industry that continues to enjoy the taxpayers' money as subsidies to the tune of $11 million a minute, $11 million a minute, you cannot deal with climate crisis. So we have to target fossil fuel industry head on. And that's exactly what this treaty idea does. We want a treaty that is complementary to Paris Agreement, because Paris Agreement has talked about what, but very little about how. And this treaty talks about ending fossil fuel expansion, phasing out, and also just transition, which is important because many developing countries are stuck with fossil fuel. Their economy depends on that. Their workers depend on fossil fuel industry. And how do we phase that out in a manner that also promotes social and economic justice. And that's how the pillar that we have in this treaty, Initiative on Just Transition, is an extremely important aspect, particularly for developing countries, but also for the developed world.
Well, one of the things, Harjeet, that the 2015 Paris Accord called for was net zero emissions by 2050. Can you explain what exactly that means and what would be required to do that? What countries have pledged to do that?
Well, we call it carbon neutral, or now this fancy term of net zero technically means that the amount of emissions we are putting into the atmosphere are then either removed or balanced by the sinks, through forest, oceans. And of course, there's a lot of emphasis on technology, so that the net emissions are zero. And while technically it is a correct term, but how many rich companies and countries have started using it to delay action, because they are talking about a net zero target of 2050. Without any near-term goals on how emissions are going to be reduced or how they are going to move away from fossil fuel. And if we only look at the 2050 targets, and many countries have pledged, and UK government is making this as a headline thing, that if countries commit to net zero, COP26 is a success. It cannot be a success unless we look at near-term targets, because science tells us that we have to halve the emissions by 2030. Just in 9 years. Where is that plan? And we don't see that plan being discussed, except a handful of countries who are talking about near-term targets. And that's not going to, make us meet the target of Paris Agreement of staying below 1.5 degree. So it is really concerning to put so much of emphasis on net zero with such longer-term time plan and not looking at near-term targets.
Well, you've also said, Harjeet, just to go to other big polluting countries now, you've said in another interview that there's a lot of pressure on India to commit to a net zero target without recognizing that comparing India and China is not fair. And if India were to commit, if it agrees to a net zero goal by a particular year, it will only be an imaginary exercise and not based on empirical studies and analysis on how it can be achieved. Explain what you mean by that.
Well, that's exactly, the problem with net zero. You just push for a number. Yes, science has told us that we need to be carbon neutral by 2050, but when it comes to allocating targets, and that's where the discussion of carbon budget becomes really important, you cannot expect all countries to become net zero or carbon neutral by 2050. Yes, if you want the common finish line, you also have to go back and look at the start line. Rich countries have been polluting for more than 100 years. For 50 years, they knew that climate change is going to be a problem. And whereas if we talk about a country like India, where industrialization began only in late 90s, you want India to have a common finish line without recognizing that 100 million people still do not have access to electricity, without realizing that a quarter of population is still poor. And comparing with China is absolutely not fair, because China's emissions and economy are 4 to 5 times of India's. So you have to understand, if India comes up with a target, it will need more time unless you provide sufficient resources. And for India, which was until the last moment was not agreeing to a net zero target, had to accede to the pressure because the whole negotiations over these 2 weeks would have become very difficult for India. India would have, just become a punching bag. So what they have done, they've released the pressure. They have come up with a date. Rich countries are saying 2050, China says 2060, India says 2070. There are no empirical studies that have been done. The states have not been consulted. But I would not blame government for this particular action, because, coming to this space, where there is so much of pressure, just on net zero, they had to put a finger on a particular year, and they chose 2070.
So you operate inside and outside the COP, I mean, at home in India, on the streets in Glasgow now, and here you are sitting inside. I wanted to ask you about the comments of researcher at Transnational Institute, Brid Brannan, who said COP26 has become a big bonanza for the corporate financiers and polluters, derailing a historic opportunity to achieve CO2 emissions and disinvestment from fossil fuels, while global popular demand to governments has urged a decisive pullback from the brink of climate change disaster. Corporate financiers and polluters have pursued a strategy of privatization of the UN system and are now positioned to derail any substantial disinvestment from fossil fuels, instead set to implement a big corporate greenwash bonanza. Harjeet Singh, can you talk about what is actually happening inside the COP and how you can derail them?
Well, I'll go back to the same problem that is at its core of negotiation, where you don't talk about fossil fuel industry, where we don't talk about the interests of corporations and how they have been trying to manage these negotiations. Until this point, they were also funding the COP process itself, and after a lot of advocacy efforts from civil society, they have been backed off, particularly for this COP. But that's not enough. As the comment clearly says, that they have increased their power, and now they are using those numbers of trillions of dollars just to say that they are on track. But in reality, they are getting a lot more power, and that's exactly the reason developing countries and civil society have been saying that we have to talk about public finance. Even that $100 billion, which is supposed to attract trillions, is not public finance. And if we rely on such private finance, where profit motive is at its core of their interest, then how are we going to achieve the kind of transition which should be seen as a public good? We are talking about people who are already facing climate crisis. We need to talk about the interest of workers if we are going to move them from fossil fuel industry to clean energy industries. So what is going to happen? How we are going to support them? Do we think this private capital is going to help them and take care of the interest of these workers and communities? Not at all. They're going to just make profits, and that's the real challenge that we have right now.
And Harjeet, could you talk more, explain the issue of climate finance and what's been happening? Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, just pledged £1 million to help developing countries deal with loss and damage. Do you expect other rich countries to follow suit, and the significance of her having done so?
Well, Scotland indeed has broken the taboo of loss and damage finance. Now, when we talk about loss and damage finance, we mean helping people who are facing the climate crisis now, who are being battered by floods and storms, and they need to rebuild their lives, and countries need to rebuild their economies. There is no stream of finance on loss and damage under this UN system. And we have been fighting for it, I would say, for 30 years, because the first time it was Vanuatu in 1991 who brought up the issue of how are we going to help countries who are being affected or who are going to be affected by climate change. And here we are. There is no stream of funding, and the United States has been blocking it right from the beginning and not even allowing it to be on the agenda of even this particular COP. And due to our lobbying, and Scotland government came up and they realized that this is a massive gap, and that's how they have pledged £1 million, which is great. The amount may not be that big, but it's a major breakthrough and puts many developed countries to shame that you should have done it. People are suffering at 1.1 degree temperature rise. Millions of people are getting displaced, and they're not getting any help. So this should definitely put pressure on other rich countries to follow suit, and that's exactly what we are doing.
Harjeet Singh, before we end, we want to address the issue of migration and its connection to climate. Kumi Naidoo, the former head of Greenpeace and Amnesty International, talks about walls as the climate wall. A new report from Transnational Institute finds some of the world's most polluting countries have spent over twice as much on border enforcement than on combating the climate crisis. The worst offenders, Canada, the U.S., Australia, and the U.K. Additionally, the world's largest fossil fuel companies employing the same companies that receive government contracts to militarize their borders. Harjeet, your response.
Well, the reality is that people who are getting displaced because of climate change, that number is increasing. And when policymakers should be alarmed with those numbers and coming up with responses so that we can help these people, the surveillance industry, as you mentioned, Amy, has seen a business opportunity. And they are using it in a very divisive manner just to make money. Whereas these people who are being displaced, and majority of them stay in their own country, you know, a fraction of that population crosses borders, and a fraction of that population then crosses international borders. So in those circumstances, we first need to talk about providing support to people so that they do not have to cross borders. And crossing borders means they are living in a real desperate situation. And that's why they leave everything and cross borders and take so much of risk. So instead of, you know, this particular crisis providing opportunity to the surveillance industry to make money, we all should be coming together and showing solidarity to these people who are getting displaced and support them so that they can rebuild their lives.
We want to thank you so much of Climate Action Network. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. Stay safe.